What's up, dude? Alright, I'm just finished with the last bunch of Caste. Yeah, I think it took me over 15 hours. I was doing pull-ups, doing exercises at home because it is incredibly smoky outside. AQI, air quality index, is about, I don't know, 500 right now in Portland. It's pretty hazardous, and I've got all the windows boarded up, all the doors closed. Got some clothes and some tape closing off some of those places where things could leak in. And so I'm hungered in. I finished this book. I'm very glad to finish it. Very well worth it. Highly recommend it. And I will tell you why now that I've finished it. It is because this book, it's it's great on multiple aspects, but what makes it great is that it touches ideas of psychology, group mentality, politics and voting, and as well as sociology, and with a hint of, I guess, virtue signaling, do the right thing type of thing, without necessarily saying, I guess what some other books and some other rhetoric passed around today is, you are inherently racist because America is a racist society. You're bad. Racism is bad. Either you're anti-racist or you're shit. All right, I really hate that. Um, and so this is it's the opposite of that. It's going at this approach where it wants to convince you based on, again, the history of America, and then comparing it to the happenings in Indian caste system as well as the Nazi Germany. All right, so this is actually my third review. I made one when I started off. I made one midway through, and then I'm making one for the end, and it's necessary because it's so long. It's 15 hours of listening. And so I want to just jump into some of these chapters because I can't just remember each and every one of them. And so I would say at this last third or last half, I guess, this book actually hit a bit of a speed bump in that the author started talking a lot about, well, anecdotal evidence. And if you're not familiar with that term, it means when you're using your own personal experience to illustrate your point. And that's fine and all, but when we talk about statistics and data, anecdotal evidence is one of the weakest forms of evidence. And in my line of work, I deal with, I have to think about evidence as well. And it's true. It's essentially anecdotal evidence is a sample size of one. Now imagine if you're trying to do a study of how much money people in America are making, and then the one person you ask is a homeless person who doesn't make any money. Well, you try and take their earnings zero, or I don't know, couple hundred, couple thousand, and then you say, okay, based on this one sample size, I think people in America are making this much. No, that's bad sampling, that's bad statistics, and that's misleading. That's why I don't like anecdotal evidence, and she does kind of go into that a bit, and she does it by various ones, I think. Also, she does start to stretch a bit. I'll give you an example. She starts to say that black people in America have, was it heart disease or hypertension because of racism? Because they have to deal with a racist society. And that's a reach. Okay, that's a reach where I can see how that could contribute. I can see why you would think that as a theory. But where's your evidence that, you know, these kind of societies, the way it's structured, is causing hypertension in black people in America? And she doesn't provide any. She just says, well, if you're black, you have to always worry. And then she points out this story about an Indian person in America having to be concerned about people finding out their caste, that they're lower caste. And then she says, okay, well, black people have the same thing. That's why they have hypertension, despite the fact that white people don't have as much hypertension, and Africans may not have as much hypertension. That's very possible, but could we look at also diet? Could we look at income? Because I think those are also highly likely. Hypertension actually runs, and heart disease also runs pretty high in Hawaii as well, where there's actually less than 3% black people. And a big part of that is because of our diet. Uh, People are a lot bigger there and like to eat. And that's not just the Pacific Islanders. Asian people, I guess Asian Americans, they like to eat too. I mean, there's some just really big Asian people there, muscular as well as just like large, like to eat type folks. All right. And so that's why it's a bit of a stretch. She kind of turned me off with that because she's kind of destroying her all the momentum she's built up. And she points out a situation where she was in first class and maybe some people don't treat her like first class. That's her experience. And then she mentioned there's this business guy and he was trying to reach for his luggage and had his like belly or shoulder on all over her. And she said that it was kind of messed up and no one helped. No one helped her because of the caste system, right? White guy, she's a black female. And again, I felt that was a reach, but she salvaged her, her credibility and reputation as like a thoughtful person when she said, maybe it's not because of caste, but I have a hard time believing if I was a white woman and a black man had his belly and shoulder over me while reaching for his luggage that no one would say a thing. And that level of self-recognition, self-realization, and understanding of, her situation, that's when it really, brings it back. Like, okay, she is a thoughtful person. She has a point when she brings this. Because if her whole book was just her talking about her experiences and saying, oh, it's because of racism. Oh, it's because of caste. It's because I'm black. It's because I'm a woman. It's because he's white. To explain every single negative interaction you have in your life, I would say maybe it's you. All right. And this is not convincing at all. But that's not how her book is laid out. It's very well thought out, and I'll continue talking about why it's so good. But that's where it hit the low. But after that, she picked right back up. So let's see what she talks about. She talks about brown eyes versus blue eyes, the experiment. Jane, she was a teacher, and she was a bit controversial because she was doing a social experiment, like a real social experiment, not these stupid ones that people on YouTube do and are completely fake and have no point. They're just trying to get views. I trust a school teacher who was, I don't know, 40 at the time versus these morons who are 20 and trying to get likes and hiring actors, actresses. Okay, a real social experiment, and I've seen it before. One instance of it where she basically took in a group and she divided them up. Was it brown eyes and then blue eyes? And I saw this live, and when she said that, okay, she said, okay, brown-eyed folks, now you have the ability to like talk smack to these folks, and blue-eyed folks, you get to go for water, but brown-eyed folk, you get to go with water, but blue-eyed folks, you can't. And it's funny because some of these blue-eyed folks, they just said, no, this is ridiculous. I will not stand for this. And this, mind you, they volunteered for this experiment. So the fact that they were so outraged and that some of them left, it shows you how soft they are. How soft they are just in life. I mean, I'm sure every aspect of your life, you're just soft and you're not meant for conflict and difficulties. So it's good that you leave. But also it highlights the idea that when you don't have these sort of, I guess, negative treatments because of an immutable quality, or even a mutable quality, like your political viewpoint, or what football team you like, or maybe how you dress. But it's when you don't get this treatment when you're young, these bad feelings, and you have to deal with them. When you have to deal with them when you're an adult, you're not going to have a lot of ability to overcome adversity. And that's what we saw in those experiments is the treatment was very arbitrary, right? Blue eyes, brown eyes. It's very arbitrary, but so are some of the laws in our country, America's history. Mostly Jim Crow. Modern day, it's more subconscious and maybe lingering effects of our history. But going back to Jim Crow and slavery and all the stories about history she tells, you can start to see, at least I really saw how very arbitrary it was. And I remember one of the statements of, I guess, segregation was separate but equal. And I guess that's fine. That kind of makes sense. I mean, look at men and women's bathroom. It's separate and equal. Except when you looked at these bathrooms for colored folks, they weren't equal. They were, you know, non-colored folks, they get the nice bathrooms. Colored folks, they get outhouses. Water fountains are less in disrepair. The schools are less funded. And the areas where they can buy houses are not as nice. And so I think segregation is okay. We kind of have some instances of it. For example, in Hawaii, we have a school where only people with Hawaiian blood can go to. But it's not at the expense of other folks, right? It's equal, separate or equal. The main issue was that it was separate, and if you were colored, you didn't get equal. You got trash. You got trash in comparison. And that's a big strong really argument of her, because if you're not getting as much, you're essentially a second class citizen, which fuels into this idea that there's a hierarchy, which is the caste system. All right, moving on. So dominant group. So that talks about group psychology, and she actually has a very good points about that dominant group. So it being white, and it doesn't matter. It's not just being white. It's being a dominant group. So if you're, I don't know, if you're Chinese in China, you're a dominant group. The Uyghurs could be considered minority groups, and how the treatments or the teasing that might happen to Uyghur folks. There are these Muslim Turkish folks, minorities in Western China. It might be the same. And same goes for Tibetan. Same goes for Mongolian. Same goes for Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese folks that might happen to live in China, as well as there's 55 minorities in China. But that really goes into it. If you're in the dominant group, you have a certain advantage in that less people will tease me. You blend right in, and you get a lot of benefit of the doubts, because the people in law, people in power, people in politics, police officers, they're more likely to be people that look like you. And if you're a minority group, you're treated as such, an outsider. All right. So she talks about that, and then she also talks about the bottom rung. She had a very interesting point. Where was it? The narcissism of caste. And that's when she starts bringing about this idea that I thought it was very poignant. The idea that, and this is an idea that I've heard before, it's that when you are not doing well in life, you at least have your group pride. Right? Let me explain. If you succeed at an individual level, that's great. And that's all you can ask for. If you are failing at life, well, then you can always focus on groups that you belong to and their successes. Right? So let's say, I don't know, you're a high school dropout, you had issues with drugs, divorced multiple times, you have kids but they don't want to talk to you. Um, you're unemployed, employed, on and off. Um, you have difficulties with money. There's a lot of things in life you may not be happy about. But if you're a Kansas City Chiefs fan, you can get a certain amount of pride and self-esteem from every time the Chiefs win. And if they win the Super Bowl, you're on cloud 10, right? It's not your achievement, right? You're not a football player, but you always see when the Super Bowl parties happen, everybody's ecstatic, everybody's happy, everybody feels successful, and vice versa. When people lose, everybody's somber, everybody's sad, everybody's heartbroken. And so that's what she's bringing into this idea of a group psychology and how it can affect our identity and feelings about ourselves. And so she's bringing this idea of how white supremacists, they may not be doing the well in their life, and that's why, and she says this phrase, at least we're white, right? So even no matter what, at least you're white, and at least you have a certain place in society. So that I'm 50-50 about that, because I don't necessarily buy into that. I can understand why it is, but do people think like that? It's hard to say. I don't. Because I always focus on my own achievements, and if I have failures, I just see them as my own failures. I never think about, I don't know, what other people in Hawaii, if Hawaii are doing, or what other Asian people are doing. That's not really me. But yeah, that's a very good point. And also, here's a tangent that she doesn't bring up. This is highly related, and it's actually, I believe that there's probably a strong relationship between being unsuccessful in life and being a group narcissist, as she calls it. She's likening it to individual narcissism, NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by grandiose ideas of yourself while also putting down others. Um, Heightened sense of self-worth, but really it's rooted in I or it's a front for an otherwise frail self-esteem, and that really defines it. I've never heard of this before. I've heard of individual at the individual level, but she's talking about at the group level. But let me continue. There was a study, and it came out, I think, a year after the Charleston protest over the Robert E. Lee statue. By the way, she has an excellent point about Robert E. Lee, and I'll bring that up in a bit. Um, but there was there was the statue being taken down, and then there was all these alt-right slash white supremacist slash neo-Nazi slash white pride guys with tiki torches saying we will not, Jews will not replace us, and probably other crazy things. And they identify with the Robert E. Lee statue. They don't want it taken down, um, because of what it symbolizes, right? That the pride of the white state or whatever. And about a year later, there was a study. I think it was either UV, University of Virginia, or Virginia University, or something. But they had a study, and I wish that more colleges or research centers would try to repeat it. But they had a study of several hundred people, and they found that the people who answered positively in the survey, that with what's the term, alt-right, white supremacist ideas or questions, you know, the more likely they are to answer and agree with those ideas, the more likely they were to be poorer, divorced, and unemployed. All right. So it makes you think, is there a connection? Going back to what I said about narcissism and what Isabel Wilkerson said about group narcissism, is there a connection between your situation in life and how likely you are to buy into, I guess, some sort of nationalistic idea? And I believe Yes, the evidence is it still needs to be dug up, but I believe so. And then if you look at if Germany, Nazi Germany, it's not just Nazi Germany did, and white and their nationalistic ideas didn't just fall out of nowhere. They had to just be destroyed and pounded into the ground by inflation and the loss of two wars and embarrassment in order for them to just be so desperate and so low that they needed something to prop themselves up. I mean, this is something that I've seen as pretty obvious in terms of why they would buy into extreme ideology. It's because they were beaten down and desperate. If you're wealthy, if you're doing well, why would you ever buy into this ideology, extreme group centric ideology? All right. So moving on to Robert E. Lee, she really does Stockholm syndrome. Okay, I'm looking at my screen. Stockholm syndrome. That was a eh, but she talks about Robert E. Lee and Confederate statues, and the more I learn about that, the more I see that as very problematic. Because I mean, I played this game on the Nintendo when I was growing up. It was called North versus South, and I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just okay. That's the old war, Civil War, and da 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 da. Shoot the other team, rob their trains, and shoot cannons. That was the game. But I didn't realize that the Confederacy lasted only for such a short time, and the fact that there are all these statues erected of generals and heroes from the Confederacy. That's two, which makes it weird. The third thing is they essentially were the losers, so why are they being honored? Um, and then the author highlighted the fact that in Germany they don't honor the Nazi losers because of what they represented, right? Forget honor or the bravery or whatnot, and states' rights, whatever. The argument that the Stowe statues, or not all of them, by the way, there's some there's some kooky people out there right now trying to tear down Abraham Lincoln statues because I don't know, because he's standing with a freed slave kneeling on his knees, and they're thinking that's somehow racist. Okay, shut up. But yeah, definitely in terms of the Confederate statues honoring people that protected and served the Confederacy, I can see why. I can see why that's an issue, and more importantly, how that might influence youth. I mean, I understand culture, and that should be in a museum. I've heard another person say, but to have that being honored and having roads honor that, I mean, you honor it's what you honor your values. It depends on the values, and so there's a Martin Luther King Boulevard everywhere. Um, it's because and we honor his values of really, really peaceful protest and civil rights movement, and him dying for that, and that's why there's a road named after him. But Robert E. Lee, he even if he was a good general, I guess what he stood for was the Confederacy's desire to keep slaves in prison because they were, free labor, very profitable. And so that's why I see it's problematic. And I had no idea that flags like, was it Mississippi or Georgia? They actually they actually had part of the Confederate flag on their flag. And so I can see why this is problematic. I can see why it can. This, mind you, that was over 100 years ago, and was it 150 years ago? And by the fact that we still have that around, I think it contributes to some of these issues. And so she told me that I'm learning here, and I'm I'm on board with her. I think she has it right there. I had no idea. I don't think we should start throwing rocks at Thomas Jefferson's statue. But for Confederate statues, I can see that. Um, yeah, and that's pretty much it. That's how she ends up. She talks about that our legacy and how it's very unlike some other countries that have. Well, I think Germany. That's the model she wants to look at, where people move past it, not forget it, but move past it and understand that that's an era of our country's history that we don't want to imitate. We don't want to honor. We don't want to be glad about. She pointed out that when people play Civil War, most of the time they want to be on the Confederate side, which is pretty fucked up because our country is founded or is based on the winners, the Northern troopers. And so that's pretty bizarre. And so this is a great book. A lot to learn, a lot to digest. I definitely want to have some discussions with my friends about this. There's so many talking points, and despite some shortcomings somewhere, I thought it was great. Also, mind you, this is an ongoing process, and she's saying that she ends with saying that you, if you are white, you are not responsible for what your ancestors, people that looked like you did, 100, 200, 300 years ago. And however, the modern day era states that because of what you look like, you are in a certain level of privilege, class, and so it would make sense for you to really use that in order to benefit people who are on the lower rungs of this class. And I guess that also includes Asian folk. Um, in terms of me, again, I don't really think much about it. It's very hard to separate the low class I was born into from, say, the class I might be put in because of my racial appearance. It's very, and also it's hard to separate that from being Asian in Hawaii, where being Asian is a not a dominant group, but it's a very well represented group, and and in a way, Asian folks in Hawaii are maybe, if there's a caste, are on the higher ends of that, not caste, but class. It would be on the higher ends because of how much, I guess, political power and economic power, and how many live in nicer areas of Hawaii. And so it's very hard for me to comment on that. But I can definitely see it. Again, I come into this whole book and this whole idea with a very objective view because, again, I grew up rarely around white people and almost never saw a black person in Hawaii growing up. And so by virtue of just not living in the mainland where it's so, this is talk is just everywhere. I just come into with an adult, fresh perspective, and it's very fascinating. In